I'm not allowed to stay.
Come join us. Yes, you are.
I gotta stand in the back and get drunk.
All right, we're all set.
All right, so I did not get a copy of the agenda for some.
Let me help Steve here.
Got it.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with the Rail Committee meeting today. We have a new member with us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Folks, I'm
That's right.
Bristol.
Our new Bristol member.
Welcome.
We were happy to get a chance to brief him yesterday with the VDOT commissioner and the other members of VDOT. So you got the a truncated, I think, 30-minute update on DRPT, but there's a lot.
Is your head spinning a little bit?
Let's put he and Fred together a little while.
Hey, Jeff, I'm not sure if I can sit across the table with you looking at cool.
The sun is coming right in.
I mean,
You ever watch those poker shows?
Are there blinds?
That way you can't see what I'm looking at.
Okay, well, yeah, there's no blinds.
There's a little
Do you want to
light.
rotate
No,
over here? Okay. All right, so before we get started, I'd like to get a motion for approval of the minutes from last meeting.
So moved.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, no comments? Okay, no, okay, all in favor, approved. We've got a lot on the agenda today. Actually, it's just a couple items, but I know that it's going to incite a lot of conversation. First, we're going to talk about our Transportation Navigator, which is a innovation project that we've been working on with some of our transit agencies in the state through a grant with FTA. So we'll talk about that. And also rail banking, which I know is a topic that Scott, you had mentioned to me as a topic of interest as we are developing the rail plan. And Emily's put together a presentation to give us kind of an overview. It's called Rail Banking 101, but we will also get into some discussion about what it may mean here in Virginia as well. So just a couple updates very quick. We have submitted our reports to the Secretary's office to then go to the General Assembly, which is our Bristol Passenger Rail Extension Study, and also our Bedford Rail Traffic Control Modeling Study. Oh, Mark, we'll get another chair for you. Here you go. Don't pull up one of them over here. Right. Good morning.
morning, Mr. Merrill. Welcome.
Mark, how are you?
Tom Fultz, our new Bristol member. Good. Okay. So we've submitted those to go to the General Assembly. I think we have, I know we briefed Tom yesterday on this, and I'm not sure about if we had a chance to brief everybody yet on the Bristol study, but the Bedford study did show, it was RTC modeling done by Norfolk Southern, did show that no additional infrastructure improvements would be needed aside from the siding and platform that is proposed to be built as well. So we've submitted that to the General Assembly. On the Long Bridge and Fourth Track project, we had submitted to an application to Federal Transit Administration to get into the pipeline for a grant program referred to as core capacity grants. And this is specifically because of the VRE access and capacity the Long Bridge will create as a result of the expansion. And so we did receive our letter accepting us into the project development process, which now starts a 2-year clock ticking, where we need to advance into the next stage of this application within 2 years. So while we complete preliminary engineering and cost estimating on that, we will hopefully at the end of 2 years be able to then advance into the next stage and move towards a full funding grant. So,
What's the potential range of funding on that?
I think we had submitted for 700 to 800 million. It's
That's substantial.
It is. There's a we have to somewhat prorate the cost of the project by the amount of benefit that is specific to commuter rail, because the program can't be used for passenger rail. And so we have to because VRE and Amtrak share it, we really have to prorate the benefits to just the
Still in
rail.
pretty good shape. That's
Yeah,
especially
and
in
then
addition.
we're asking for up to a 50% share, federal share. Unlike highway projects where federal funds can be used up to 80%, in this program for FTA, it's only up to 50%. And so, but it's still a substantial grant amount. This does not mean though we're not going to see other sources of grant funding, particularly with the infrastructure bill. I know Nick's going to give a presentation later on more about what that means for Virginia, but we expect that there could potentially be some passenger rail funds through that program that we could apply towards either Long Bridge or other projects that are in our Transforming Rail in Virginia program.
Sorry, I thought we were environmental committee.
Oh, sorry.
I'm in the wrong meeting.
Oh, yeah, you guys might be across the hall. You're welcome to stay.
Get out of here, will you?
Thanks for your input.
See, Mr. Merrill.
What happened next on the Bedford
He's
study?
kind of new too. Don't worry about it.
Well, so Emily had a meeting with Bedford. He asked about the next steps with Bedford. We have submitted, actually, that was my next item, a couple applications for a federal grant program referred to CRISI, C-R-I-S-I. It's an acronym, Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grants. The feds love their acronyms. So we have actually submitted 2 applications, and one of them is to do NEPA and preliminary engineering work at Bedford. For the Bedford station. The other one is to do state of good repair improvements at the Ettrick station just south of Petersburg.
So we need to conduct a full EIS for the Bedford station.
No, it'll probably be an EA.
Oh,
So,
okay.
Or even a categorical.
Good.
yeah,
Thank-
probably,
thank-
actually,
thank
probably
you.
more likely a category.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
But-
when does that, I mean, in round numbers, when is that likely to begin? Stop.
Well, we just applied for the grant at this point, for the federal grant, and I think it's probably at least 6 months away, 3 to 6 months away before they would announce the grants. And then, so we would begin if we got the grant after that.
So, I mean, what's realistic? I'm listening to, the chatter out there about this.
I think if we're successful in getting the grant, then I'd say late next year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but that again would be dependent on getting the grant. Alternatively, they'd have to find another source of funding. So,
You all did a nice job, by the way, that public hearing. I thought that really went well.
Thank you. We did
Good
that
work.
as an internal effort. So Haley and the communications team did a lot of that too.
and just one more grant application to tell you about. We submitted a joint application with North Carolina DOT with support from Amtrak as well for a grant to do final design on the S line, which is the line again connecting North Carolina to Virginia. That was something that Amtrak is supporting as well. So it really has been led by North Carolina DOT, but we submitted letters of support for it jointly.
Jennifer, are these projects DRPT focused or Virginia Passenger Rail focused, or both? And how do you differentiate the responsibilities for the two?
$10,000 question. It's really a little bit of both right now. So we had, I guess did all the grant applications come from VPRA? Was that it? Yeah, okay. But as far as planning activities, sort of the bigger corridor statewide planning level responsibilities are still with DRPT. For things like NEPA and preliminary engineering, that's led by VPRA. So, yeah.
It will S-line be passenger only? We've had no,
I believe the way it is, we would CSX would have the ability to run freight on it, but it'd be developed as for passenger speeds.
the next to be in the opposite position with those guys.
Yeah, they're running local freight on it in North Carolina.
Yes.
Up to North Carolina.
Yeah, up in
Before
North
it's up,
Carolina.
yeah.
Yep.
Jennifer, without going into the details, what's the status of the consideration you all are giving, coming up with, I guess, a policy on station operation and construction funding?
Well, we discussed that, I think, was it 2 meetings ago or the last meeting? Yeah.
Yeah, so where are we? I mean, what are we gonna be seeing something?
So the rail plan we plan to have that out in the spring. I'll be coming back to this group in January and February to talk about policies and kind of synthesize the input that I got the last time I talked to you all, and some discussions that we had with CRA, and I'll come back to you all then. Thanks.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to wrap up my updates, and we're going to get started with our next item of our transportation navigators. We have Brittany Vole and Wood Hudson from our transit team to talk about it.
You want to go back?
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm Wood Hudson. I'm one of the transit planners here at DRPT.
And I'm Brittany Vole. I'm a transit program manager. I work with the 5310 program. That's an FTA program that supports transportation for seniors and individuals with disabilities. And actually, I'm going to give a little bit of information about that before we get into the presentation. So DRPT administers the Section 5310 funding, and one of the requirements of that program is that we develop what's called a comprehensive human services mobility plan that looks at the transportation needs of specialized populations across the state, and then recommends things to address those needs. And one of the recommendations that came out of our last plan that was updated in 2019 was to create regional one-click centers. And I'll talk about that term in a couple of slides. And so under the 5310 program, we have what's called mobility managers, and they are supposed to work with the public to connect people with transportation that meets their needs. So when we were going through the process of updating our coordinated human service mobility plan in 2019, we were working very closely with those mobility managers to find out what they were hearing in the community and what needs they knew were out there, and also what they needed to do their work better. And one of the things that they asked for was a map, one place where they could go to see all of the transportation services that were available in the Commonwealth. Because when they're getting calls from people who need rides, you know, they need somewhere where they can go and see that information and know where to refer them. So we thought that was a great idea, and we incorporated that into our process of updating the Chisholm plan. But from that, we realized there was broader application for that. Really, anybody in the public that needed transportation could benefit from one place, a one-click system where they could find transportation options. So we kind of put a pause on the project that we were working on then and started looking at what we could do to make a public-facing platform that was user-friendly and would help people get the transportation they needed. So around the same time, the FTA announced this Mobility for All grant program, and DRPT was in a perfect position then to submit an application that was funded at 100% to develop a platform, a one-click platform, utilizing the existing structure of Virginia Navigator to give people the transportation information that they needed. So we actually structured that to be a two-part project. One, developing that public-facing platform and a widget that we could put on our website and any other website in the Commonwealth where people might go looking for transportation so that they could find those resources. And then the second part. Yes.
Can I ask an introductory question? So the first part of this was aimed at some more senior populations.
Seniors and individuals with disabilities.
So I'm assuming at the start of this, you did some analysis of correspondence of that population's access to what I would consider to be the key device and utilizing these services. What did you find that correspondence to be? It's one of the challenges that I've faced in even dealing with senior members of my family, is they're ill-equipped to take those steps.
I absolutely understand. And so it's kind of a two-part answer to that. One, the mobility managers work in their communities with people who don't have that access. So they can actually set up rides for people and tell them, you know, they're going to be at your house at this time to pick you up. You don't need an app or a website that you access to book that. They're able to do that. And then the other thing that we loved about working with Virginia Navigator is that they have over 700 partner centers in the community that are things like area agencies on aging, libraries, transportation centers, just a wide variety of places where somebody who doesn't have computer access or a cell phone can go to use Virginia Navigator or be assisted in using Virginia Navigator to find those resources. So hopefully we're covering all populations there.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. So the second part of the project was developing general transit feed specifications, which do you just want to talk briefly about that before we go into the slides?
So I guess at the highest level, you can think of the general transit feed specification as like the PDF format for transit information. It's kind of a a format that contains all the information related to a route, schedule, stop locations, and it's a system agnostic kind of data set. So it's not tied to any proprietary software. It allows that information to be exchanged between everything from an app on your phone to the Google Maps environment. So it's a really powerful tool, and it's kind of become the de facto standard way to digitally share transit, schedule, and trip information kind of across the industry. So it's a tool that we've integrated into this platform and worked with some technical experts to provide technical services to a lot of our smaller transit agencies that really don't have the capacity to develop and maintain these data sets themselves. And we've been able to, through this process, develop feeds for an additional 12 agencies and kind of round out and find and track down feeds for the remaining agencies in the Commonwealth. At this point, we're working on what we refer to as our fixed route transit services, so the ones that have the bus stop and the sign. Our next phase is hopefully to implement a new standard that has been developed called GTFS Flex, which allows us to capture those dial-a-ride, rural on-demand kind of services that don't have that fixed route structure. But that's kind of new in the standard, and we're hopefully going to be able to kind of push the envelope there and be one of the first states to start to implement that standard.
So I'm just going to give a little overview of what our Transportation Navigator kind of looks like, and then Wood will give you an overview of how GTFS works. So Virginia Navigator is the parent site, and under their family of sites, they have Senior Navigator, Disability Navigator, and Veterans Navigator, with each site tailored specifically to that population. So resources for either that population or caregivers who are searching for a loved one. So on each of those three sites, we've added this new transportation tab with a couple umbrella transportation types in the drop-down menu. But you can click on the transportation page, and there's a few things here. So first, we give an overview of what transportation is, along with a link to a glossary of terms. We thought it was really important to use the industry standard terms because that's what people will encounter if they go to a transit provider site, but people might not know what those are, so we defined them here. There's also a link to the widget, which I'll show in 2 slides. And then categorization of types of transportation that we thought people might go looking for. So if somebody clicks on one of these types of transportation, then the site will load all of the transportation resources that meet that categorization in the Commonwealth. So this actually goes beyond just transportation for seniors, veterans, and individuals with disabilities, and it covers all types of transportation that's available to the public. So this is showing what happens if you were to click on public transit. So it's broad. There's 247 local resources, 257 statewide. And then from there, somebody can filter by city, county, or zip code to find a provider that actually serves their community.
Is there any way for a user to customize it for themselves so that they don't have to put all that data in every time they want to get to some place?
Within the structure of this site, there is not, but
Okay.
One thing that we are looking at doing, we actually just submitted another grant application to the FTA under a different program to look at expanding this platform. So this is kind of the base level. Stage 1 is what it's considered, just making the information available. And as you move into stages 2 and 3, there's additional functionality within a one-click system. And so we've submitted an application to build upon this and grow toward a stage 2 or stage 3.
Yeah,
to
like with
start having
preferences and that sort of thing. So if I live in Bristol, I really may not want to see every time that I got to get to Bristol, but click this, click that, go to this, do that. I
Exactly.
just want to see what, this kind of transportation in Bristol. If it saves my preferences like so many websites do, then I can just get there.
Right.
Second question I'd have is, are we going to track usage by area, by region, by whatever?
So since this is on a website, we've asked Virginia Navigator to use Google Analytics to analyze where people are coming from and what they're doing when they get to these sites. It's also tied to our reporting requirements for the FTA grant, because we want to know if people are using it. I'm curious to know if they're actually located in Virginia and in a locality where they're looking for
Exactly.
resources. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
So those are things we're going to be gathering quarterly.
Thank you.
So in addition to the services themselves, there's relevant articles, books, guides, and links about transportation. And then the other way to look for transportation outside of the site is this widget that I mentioned we have on the DRPT website. And we also have several partner agencies that have posted this on their website. And so this is a little bit simpler way to search for transportation. It has the same categorization as the 3 pages. And then the service area dropdown is all of the localities in the state. So if somebody were to go here to search, they could choose the type of transportation they're looking for and their area and kind of bypass all of that clicking through the transportation pages. But it's on there.
So I'll kind of close things out, and what we've done here is I've taken a couple screenshots of kind of how this Google Transit feed specification data set works. So you're probably all very familiar with searching for routes, driving routes in Google Maps. You know, it's kind of the de facto way when we're looking to figure out where we're going, we use Google Maps. So it's really important that we get this information where people are. Google Maps, Bing Maps, Apple Maps, and then to the third-party app developers that develop things like the Transit app or the other apps for navigating transit systems on your phone. So in Google, once all this information is fed into the Google system, it allows us to do things like, say we wanted to go from Bottoms Up Pizza to the Greater Richmond Convention Center. We can put in that information, we can toggle over onto the Google Maps transit setting, which I think is supposed to be a subway car. I've always questioned their use of glyphs on this. Put in that information, it can pull in all of that transit data from this standard and give you route options. In this case, it's recommending that we take the pulse. It shows that we need to walk to the closest bus stop, which buses to look at, which time the buses will be arriving, kind of provides all of that information. And one of the really nice things is it also provides this kind of trip plan, because people don't read bus schedules anymore. When was the last time somebody sat and looked at the grid and did this? So it presents it in that way that is much, much easier for humans to understand in a table of numbers. So it kind of gives you this trip plan. And when you're searching, you can do things like, instead of saying, oh, I need to leave now, you can say, well, I have a meeting in an hour and I need to arrive at my meeting 15 minutes before. What are my options? And it'll say, okay, if you catch, the 1C in 7 minutes, that will get you there. And having these GTFS feeds is what allows us to keep this information accurate and to provide this information in a way that people are going to use it. If we put it out somewhere in some corner of the internet, it's hard for folks to find. Go ahead.
So question, kind of following up with the thoughts conveyed by Mr. Miller. Are you planning on standing up a user test group early on in this process? Because everything I hear you say with enthusiasm about making a feature-rich product. And very often, and I'd say most often in this case, less is more.
Yeah.
And so we have an inclination, because we want to do more, to do things. You say you're moving over to another page, you're looking at other options, but I think it needs to go through the screen of a cohort of actual users that are there for testing this from the earliest phases. So I just suggest everything you're saying is very exciting, but I think of my mom back when she was attempting to do things of this nature and how quickly she became confused. So I would just strongly suggest that early on, I'm sure you can find many volunteers in any geographic area that would want to be part of such a test, and filter it through them. Because our greatest ideas may not be something that they can actually utilize or want in that process.
Absolutely.
Following on to that, do we have an expectation of how many people will use this, and will they be mobility type people helping other people, or will they be individuals using it themselves? So is it 100,000? Is it 5,000? What's success for us?
That's a great question, and something we haven't even really defined for ourselves, since it's the first time that we've had something like this of this size and scope covering the entire Commonwealth. There's right now only 2 places in the state where there are one call, one click systems operating. There's one in Williamsburg and one in Culpeper, and they're more robust systems where they actually have staff that answer phone calls and do things like that, where we're really focused on getting this web piece out there to support a broader population. So I think right now we have, lower goals set for ourselves and looking at things like how many people are engaging meaningfully with the site before we set a number of how many people we want to use the site.
I would like to, in general, and it's hard to do, I get it. But so we're spending money to develop something, right? And if I'm in a business and you ask me for some capital, I'm going to say, okay, what return am I going to get? And I'm going to want to know how many people I think are going to use this site before I spend the capital. I want to know that, or I want to at least have an objective that I think is reasonable, right? And too often we do it because we can get money and it's a good thing to do. And I think it's a great thing to do. But the question is, what does success look like? So if we built this thing and 1,000 people used it a year, is that success? Or is it 10, or is it 100? And at the end of the day, it's sort of like building a bike lane. Bike lanes are great, but you go to places that are getting money from us to build bike lanes, and you say, and this needs to be fixed in smart scale, by the way. You say, what's the goal for the amount of bikers that makes this make sense? And they look at you like you have 3 heads. Well, what do you mean? Well, the bike lanes. I mean, people like bike lanes. Let's put some bike lanes in. I'm like, well, listen, if we got 50 people using it, it was a waste of time and money. If we have 5,000 people using it, then, and we don't always know. I get it. There's some build it that will come, and I'm all for that. But I think we got to go in with at least some sense of what the goal is to justify us spending the money.
Two things to jump in on their great presentation.
Yes,
One, the Federal Transit Administration has performance metrics for this program. So we've had staff from FTA, but it's also the DCC, which I can't remember. It's
National Aging and Disability Transportation Center.
Thank you. We have their staff that have been with us every step of the way for that performance metric side. Because this is a relatively new technology, they're kind of following along with us to see how it does work. But I also wanted to mention that was why it was so important for us in the beginning to partner with a resource that is already known in the community with Virginia Navigator. And they're a nonprofit that's been around for 20 years for the purpose of providing this type of information to these particular communities.
Sure.
And so instead of going off and doing something completely on our own, which we could have done, we're building on a backbone of a system that has been in place for 20 years. And we have done this in partnership with the state social service agencies. We had Department of Medical Assistance Services, Aging and Rehabilitation Services. She knows all of them way better than I do, but we quarterly have a working group with our counterparts in all of the social service agencies that have helped structure and build this. So we totally understand where you're coming from. We built this with the intent of serving the community, and we've started that using platforms and working with people that are working in that community every day. We're not. And
So, and my mother was in that field, and I'm familiar with it, back in the day. But so I hope we will keep an eye on what those results are and report to the board about, how we're doing, at the appropriate times. And frankly, in general, I think we need to do more of that so that we ask ourselves the hard questions, and listen, that doesn't mean we don't take some risk and have something we spend too much money on and fail because people just don't do it. And I'm not suggesting that, but I think we got to be, careful, and we got to learn from that. And the performance metrics or the goals or whatever you want to call them will help us do that.
And I want to also add that this is a very low cost project. I think we are at less than $150,000, less than 100, even better. And
Scott, I spent that on dinner last night.
I had a big bar tab.
I'm just teasing, it's a joke.
We did that with leveraging this federal discretionary money that we were able to bring to Virginia with some ITTF money. We've been over there with a number of projects in the Innovation Committee as well. And then the second phase of this is going to add more functionality and bring it to your fingertips in terms of mobile applications for either caregiver or for a senior
That should be
or
distinction
veteran.
as well.
Yes,
Yeah,
and
we
so
want them in that cohort of trainees or testers.
Focus groups,
and
yeah.
so as we look to move to that next level, we just applied for another federal grant
We're already working with Kathy McGee on Match from ITTF. I mean, really, this is cutting edge stuff, trying to put information at people's fingertips, and very proud of the work.
It's the point of the spear, I agree.
Well done.
This is great work.
I have just one more thing to add, kind of along those lines. Actually, this evening, we're getting a presentation from a team of master's eligible students from VCU that we've been working with that's going to be making recommendations about things like outreach and how to build on this platform. And they're also going to provide us with a survey that we can distribute to the mobility managers that work in the state to get their feedback on the system and find out how it's working for them,
Fantastic.
So you give them
things
some
like
of
that.
that. right.
Yeah. Did you task them with that? Was that a
Yes.
collaborative? Excellent. Excellent.
I think VCU, we have a whole bunch of VCU.
That's a
Types.
great addition to this.
Yes, I love.
Go Monarchs. I'm sorry.
That was actually the end of our presentation.
Help me focus in on the scope of this. Can a person put in their home address and then put in the address of, let's say, their doctor, whatever?
On the GTFS piece, which I think is what is bringing up now, that's,
Just to bring up our-
okay.
the widgets.
I don't know if I can get
our
websites down.
Oh.
Oh, well, technology. We need some broadband in this Commonwealth. Just saying.
Not.
So there's kind of two pieces. There's the GTFS piece that Wood talked about, which was making that data available through Google Maps. And so through that, somebody could absolutely put in any address they want to travel from to any address they want to
Right.
travel to, and that would provide any fixed route transit options. But if there is no fixed route available, which might be the case for a lot of areas of Virginia where the populations I work with are generally in more rural areas that don't have public transit available, that's where the Virginia Navigator piece would come in. And so the only thing that somebody could put in there would be
Yeah.
either the locality that they live in or their zip code. So it's not so specific by address. But with this new system, that the next level that we're looking at going to, the stage 2 and stage 3 and building on what we've already done, that functionality would be.
Okay, so the person who cannot drive for whatever reason would be able to go in and find how that person can get from, let's say, home to their doctor,
Yes, exactly.
including all public transportation services that might be available.
Right.
Okay, now I use Google Maps, so I understand, it tells you, how long it's gonna take you to walk, how long you can get on a bus, get on an airplane, yada, yada.
Mhm.
Suppose I want to go from home, wherever that is, to an address in New York City. Will this be of any help? Or is
There-
this just a local system?
Well, we're adding transportation providers that are located in Virginia, but it would be dependent upon where they provide services. So I can think of 4 companies off the top of my head that I know transport seniors and individuals with disabilities with no limit on where they go. So if you wanted to go from here to New York, they would take you from here to New York. But the number of providers that do that in the state, I don't think is very large.
But will it also provide providers that access to information to providers who are not geared to serving a particular group, a la Amtrak?
So when we go to phase 2, depending on who the vendor is that we select, we looked at a number of different ones, and a lot of them use, I'll call it the Google Maps framework that we all are very used to using.
Right.
And they pull that information into it, pulls in all of that information, and then they kind of layer in the additional resources. So yes, that environment would say if you wanted to go from Wise, Virginia to New York City, it would pull in and it would say, one of your options might be get on the Virginia Breeze, take the Virginia Breeze up to Washington DC, and then get on a different bus or get on the Amtrak. So it would have that ability because once you've pulled in those Google resources, its knowledge is essentially infinite. And it just depends on which vendor and which kind of set of tools would be.
And would it permit the user to say, I'm mobility impaired? So you know, I may not be able to get on the Virginia Breeze unless someone who deals with the mobility impaired gets me there.
Yes. Yeah, and
That's great.
one of the things, we're looking at the qualified transportation, having the ability to filter and say, yes, I use a wheelchair or service animal, or I travel
Very
with
good.
a companion.
I certainly recognize the comments that Scott and that Chef have brought forward. But, you know, we've got 26 community college facilities around the state. They were set up to be within 50 miles of every Virginia. And in the rural areas, we got lots of folks that fit the ALICE category, which is asset limited, income constrained, and employed.
Mhm.
And I know at least where I am on the Eastern Shore, we've got the community college, and one of the major issues is the people who would like to come to college don't have the funds to be able to necessarily find their way. And this would be a fantastic way around the state. So to impact those folks, and my recommendation would be is you need to sit down with somebody at the community college system here at the CCS. And I'd be happy to make that introduction if you'd like, to bring this thing forward so they can bring it to their campuses to be able to utilize it in their individual areas.
Great. All right, well, great presentation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So next, I'm going to ask Emily to come up and talk about rail banking.
Cool.
Good morning. And this is, as you all might recall, I started this in November and we ran out of time. So got more time till almost 10 o'clock this morning to talk about rail banking. And this is a primer, and I am learning as I go on this because I'm not an expert. So just bear with me and we'll try to get the answers together. We've gotten a lot more questions recently about rail banking. As you can imagine, now that we have Transforming Rail in Virginia out there, and Virginia Passenger Rail Authority is up and running, the ownership dynamic has definitely changed. And so the questions that we've gotten over the years about rails to trails and rails with trails, where we usually have told people to talk to the railroads or given them information about the Class 1 railroads. Now some of those questions are coming to us. And so as part of the rail plan, we want to deal with this issue head on and have a section on rail banking policy, rails to trails, rails with trails, and work closely with BPRA on that policy, closely with you all on that policy to make sure that we're headed in the right direction. So I just wanted to get out there today some of the I guess parameters, some of those guardrails that we have, some of the systems that are already in place for rail banking now.
It's a great introduction. Very comprehensive. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. What is rail banking? It is a provision of the National Trail System Act of 1968. It came along in 1983 officially, and it allows abandoned railroad lines to be used as a trail. So very simply, and how does it happen? It happens when a railroad files an abandonment application with the Surface Transportation Board, the STB, for permission to eliminate rail service. And as a provision of that, there is a way that you can issue an interested party can issue a notice of interim trail use, also a good acronym for that, an NITU, notice of interim trail use, and focus on the interim. We'll talk about more about that in a minute.
Emily, but this prompts a question. So do we always as DRPT file as an interested party when potential rail abandonments are coming up?
We don't have a practice of that. DRPT is the state agency responsible for railroads of the abandonment. So we have all of those abandonment files in our possession. So we keep track of all of those, but we don't, an interested party would be a trail group.
Well, I would think that we generically are interested as overseer of private rail infrastructure, or at least the actions and opportunities associated with that. So do we need a policy directive that says that we would always file as an interested party? I mean, that seems to be kind of ground zero from a perspective of our doing our diligence on this. I suggest if there's an opportunity to make that a policy initiative, we should do it.
What does it mean to file the notice though? What does that really mean? What's that?
So it's a notice of interim trail use.
And rail banking, the purpose of rail banking is really to allow interim use as trails, but to be able to preserve the corridors. Should there be customers in the future? Should there be a need to reintroduce rail service or freight service? So this is, it's.
Reversion.
Yeah.
And that's
Exactly.
why I think we'd be interested parties. I can't imagine that we wouldn't.
In following Scott's lead on this, I think we need to find a way to have a policy that if there's a rail trail, if there's a right of way, and most of them are 66 feet wide, two sets of tracks, that we need to be looking within the state to preserve those rights of way, because we're never going to be able to create a new one, or most likely.
Yeah.
So being able to protect what we have, I think, is really critical. And at least being in place so that it doesn't get abandoned, because what happens when it goes to an abandonment situation is it gets broken up. It gets sold off, and the legal process is everybody that owns a piece along the railroad has an option to be able to acquire that particular piece. You know, I've got the situation that's going on right now on the Eastern Shore. It's in the rail, it is looking to be a rail trail, and they are looking to find out a facility by July 6th of 22 to be able to protect that right of way long term. It's a 49.5 mile trail.
Cousin, I'm confused here by this. Maybe I'm just not well educated. So a railroad decides to file a notice of abandonment, and that starts this process. And somebody files that as an interested party. It could be me, because it can be a private entity. It could be a nonprofit. It could be a governmental entity. It could be the OPT. It could be anybody. But here it says on the slide, acknowledgement of the trail use continue to meet the above obligation and the possibility of future reactivation of rail service on the corridor. So doesn't that mean that whoever has it is subject to reversion?
Yes.
And so why are we?
Absolutely.
So I was hearing you say we need to protect it so that it doesn't go away. Well, it doesn't go away because reversion exists for no matter who has it.
But to
Right.
Mr. Johnson's point, if this isn't adequately handled on the front end, it ends up getting chopped into pieces for various uses. The infrastructure itself, the rail bank and the typically at or near grade right of way can be changed, modified, added to. Sewer lines can be added, power lines can be added, which make it very difficult in the reversion process to reuse that facility.
But don't you, I mean, at some point, I have to think it through a little bit more, but at some point, the railroad doesn't just willy-nilly abandon stuff, right? That's not their MO.
Of course they do.
They hold
Yeah.
on to it for a long time and before it's actually abandoned. And we've been through that process with railroads before and actually tried to get other railroads interested. And Jeremy has lots of experience with that.
So
There's a lot more to
let me
this
finish.
STB process.
So what I'm trying to get at is, are we talking about, or are you guys talking about, let's get us involved every time so that we can sort of control the process?
Understand the process would be my perspective, and be proactive where we need to be proactive. We shouldn't learn about this in the very final stages.
Well, they file it with us. We know in the beginning. When they got to send it to us. We know right before anybody does, right?
No,
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
they
do.
file with the Surface Transportation Board.
They-
Yeah, but it's, I thought we were the,
no.
Jeremy,
Well, we will get a notice from the STB.
exactly.
So they'll file with STB and then we get.
So we're not going to be surprised.
Well,
That's the
But we
state
have to be-
agency responsible for railroads of the abandonment. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Right,
for
so we
that
know.
agency.
But we to protect the ultimate utilization of the right of way long term, when STB gets the notification that of a potential abandonment and DRPT gets notice, then what do we do with that notice if somebody doesn't step up to be able to protect the right of way long term? we
And,
have to be in a position or have a policy to be able to do that.
and we can object to the abandonment.
Do you want to add something, Jeremy?
So
We
part
can
of the
what?
STB
We can
is
what?
we can object to the abandonment.
Let
But we
me,
can say it's necessary to
Ooh.
continue service. So it's much deeper than that.
Ooh,
so I'll give two examples. The first one would be out in the farthest western parts of Virginia, almost to the West Virginia border. We've had very small pieces, less than a mile, that have come in for an abandonment.
Coal
And so-
mines, right?
Right, little John's up to
Little
areas
spurs.
that are no longer, yes. And so that would be something that we would also get noticed. And so if we were to file for that to be used as an interim trail use, it's a little bit difficult to make trail use out of every little piece. And sometimes this is a cascade event. You start to chop away little bits, and over time the rail line falls apart, and then you get that last big piece. But then you have another example of the S line, which we have now purchased. Now, CSX abandoned that years ago before there was a DRPT. And there are at least about 3 miles of it that reverted back to the neighboring property owners. So what we purchased is not a contiguous line because nobody went in and protected it with an interim trail use or some other public use to keep that one contiguous right of way.
I guess what I'm struggling with is the difference between that sort of deal where we're that we're always aware. Number one, you're telling me we're always aware. Number two, if somebody else isn't interested, we probably should be. But should we control it all? You know, are we looking to this policy to control the ultimate use of this abandoned?
I'm not sure where control comes into this. This is really just,
Well, because you're talking about infrastructure that people
No,
might
no,
build,
no.
you're talking about.
my recommendation was that we engage in the process.
You're asking, let me give you the answer. So you're talking about messing it up, right? The private operator messes it up. They put in sewer, they put in this, you can't revert, the railroad crossing is messed up. And you said, so it'd be hard to make it right if we used it.
I'm not sure where that piece came from.
Well, that's what you
My
said.
point is that we gain knowledge and visibility by being involved through a simple application to be an interested party in this on the front end.
And so one thing that that I want to learn more about, you know, we're here talking about rail banking, rails to trails, rails with trails, because that seems to be the biggest interest right now. But preserving the corridor for transportation purposes in perpetuity is really the goal. And so I'm talking here about an interim trail use, a notice of interim trail use. There are other steps that you can take through this abandonment process to, I think, to preserve the right of way without actually an interim trail use. So what I would like to do
As the S line.
is look at, well, and I don't know if that was ever actually
Rail bank.
abandoned. It may not be. It was okay, not rail bank, but it was abandoned. Anyway, what I'd like to do is find out more about a notice of interim trail use alternative that would hold something in transportation use, but that might not obligate us to what's here. So
That's what I'm
if
concerned
you have
about.
if you file for a notice of interim trail use as you know, a trail entity, you know, a group that wants to,
Sponsoring party.
right, the sponsoring party that wants to build a trail, you have to accept financial responsibility to manage a trail, pay property taxes on the trail, accept responsibility for liability X, Y, Z. And so is there a way to kind of hold
Preserve
this
the
off
corridor
or preserve the corridor
without doing that.
I don't know
Singing
the
my
answer. It may be that you would have that financial responsibility to maintain it just as a corridor. But that's something that we need to look into. I'm focused on trails on this.
So if we
for
looked
this
at the High Bridge
presentation,
Trail,
but
if we
there
looked
could
at,
be another
you're familiar with the High Bridge Trail, right? And I don't know who has that or who doesn't have that. We don't have it,
State park, no.
right? Excuse me?
State park, no. Like High Bridge.
I don't know who, you know, but, okay, so the state owns it and they maintain it and they do everything.
Yes, it's state park.
Is it?
Yes,
Here,
it'd be
I've got a
DCR.
map of those.
All I'm getting at is exactly what she just said in the presentation. And I'm, you know, I don't want to control everything, number one. I want to control the important stuff. Number two, I don't want to take on more liability and cost if we can have less to get to the same place. So I don't really know what it means when you file the notice as an interested party. What does that really mean?
It means we're interested.
Well, I don't know. I'm asking now.
Well, and I'll use the Eastern Shore as an example. It was not us who filed for as an interested party. It was another trail group that has done some other efforts. But that meant that party has now started the process, that there's a schedule that you have to meet in order to enter into an agreement with somebody to turn it into a trail use. So if you don't reach agreement with some party in the future, then that it will eventually expire. Which is
So if we did that as a group, the DRPT or whatever, we filed on everyone or filed on whatever ones. What does that mean? What does that mean to us? What do we need to do
it
that?
buys us time to investigate.
And if you did it and I did it and DRP did it, we all filed, right? You as a private entity and I, whatever. How do they adjudicate that? What does that mean?
Well, you have to demonstrate that you have financial responsibility, that you can take on the financial responsibility to make it a trail. And that's for the notice of interim trail use. What I'm saying is that there may be another,
That's where I'm at.
another vehicle for preserving the corridor for transportation that might not be a notice of interim trail use. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the process for that and negotiating.
But I have a question. So by the time it gets to the point of interim trail use, it has already been approved for abandonment. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Because it's a multi-step process with the STB.
We're talking about the most extreme example of doing away with rail service because there are other levels. There's different types of abandonment where it can stay in place and be used as a non-functioning railroad use, which actually we're going to do with the service facility. So we will abandon it. It won't be active right away. We're going to use it. And then there's also discontinued use where it's not abandoned, it's still going to be there. So we're talking about the most extreme example at the end where on the Eastern Shore especially, they've said there is no business case to save this line. And we have an obligation. We're going to have obligations we can't handle. So we're going to abandon this. We're going to ask the STB. We need to get rid of it. And then a group stepped in and said, that is great for many uses, not just a trail, but also for some other infrastructure. And so that's where we are now, is negotiating. What does that look like? How's it going to be used? Because the STB has said you have this much time to negotiate that, which is July 2022.
So here's my question as relates to that. If it gets to the point that it's in the active consideration as a rail trail, is it incumbent upon the applicant that gets selected to maintain it, or it is? They require that it be revertible.
Oh,
Certain?
that's what I have read, and I've got some slides on that too. Right here, I've got a little bit of information about the process itself and the timeline that Jeremy mentioned. So once that notice of interim trail use is filed, the railroad would then potentially agree to negotiate with the NITU proponent. And after the STB grants the abandonment, then the parties have 1 year to negotiate a notice of interim trail use. And I'm going to talk about the details of that in a second. During that negotiation period, the railroad may remove rail ties, but leave the bridges and culverts in place. And the Eastern Shore is really it's a good case study for this, because that's what's happening right now. So right now, the trail group has filed this notice of interim trail use. They are taking up the rail ties and leaving the bridges and culverts in place. I think there aren't any bridges.
There are no bridges.
Culverts.
A couple of culverts.
There's no bridge.
No bridges.
And then
It's flat, baby.
it's very
Wow.
flat. And the negotiations
level
may
flat.
extend 3 times by the STB. And from what I understand, they've already used up all their extensions.
They've gotten one extension, and that's a drop dead date of July 6, 2022. And where they are currently is they are looking at a nonprofit to be the organization to take over responsibility for doing the trail. The assets are owned by Canoni as a corporation. That's a Virginia corporation. It is overseen by the Accomack Northampton Transit District Commission. And that is who owns the 1 share of stock in the asset owner. And that's what those folks are put on that board, if you will, by the 2 counties or supervisors. And at this point in time, they are looking to be able to develop further the rail trail program. There's been a study done by VDOT, talks about the viability of making that happen, talk about economic development, what have you. And I personally believe that within the next couple of weeks, they will have the vehicle that they're going to need to take over from the original interim group. So I think we'll have a long-standing facility to be able to do that.
So,
And the state won't be paying for it.
No.
See, so in general, Scott, I share your concern about rail corridors and so forth. I also am an advocate for the general public, but if we can be in the role of facilitating that to happen, as opposed to controlling it and taking it ourselves and having costs associated with it, I'd be a lot more comfortable with that.
I would not disagree with that at all. But at this point, needing visibility into the process, and actually the STB
And we need to
process,
understand it a little better too.
it is a very tiered and hierarchical process, which this is kind of the end result of. But the other option that exists in some circumstances is the railroad can sell the facility. They can sell an existing right of way, so it doesn't really. Yeah.
At the Virginia Creeper Trail, they gifted it to a 501c3.
Right, because there's no economic use for it out there. But if you take more valuable rail infrastructure in places that NS and CSX are operating, if they don't have an economically viable alternative, they go through this process, they can actually sell it. And that's why I want to make sure that we don't miss any of these pieces in the process. So I'm not sure if signing on at that point is the right place to be.
Right, I hear you.
But we need
I
to
get it.
understand the reversion process and make sure that we're actively engaged where we should be.
Yes.
And I would add to that, and we talk about this quite a bit prior to your entry to this group, Chet. I've been an advocate. I've been an advocate for a more interactive.
You're in if you want.
Yeah, you're here. An interactive relationship with our class 1 partners in particular, because they know years in advance when they've got a facility that may be subject to abandonment or to sale. This doesn't come as news flash. All of a sudden, we're going to do this. We could, in fact, be in early negotiations with them if it made sense on critical pieces of infrastructure to make sure that it doesn't have to go through this process, or if it does, that it goes through the process with us as an early partner. That can happen too, and it does happen in other situations in other states. North Carolina is probably the perfect example of that.
And Emily, I'd like to hear, not today, but a little more conversation about when or if the Commonwealth should acquire abandoned corridors. Let's say there's a notice of abandonment. Nobody wants to do a trail project. Scott said, the railroad may sell it to the ABC company or whatever. But the Commonwealth, it seems to be, needs to at some point assert its either ownership or control of these potentially valuable corridors. If we wanted to do an S-line type deal, 40 years in the future, it may get held up.
Or it may not be.
Yeah,
It may not be there.
gone. Yeah.
It may be gone.
The opportunity.
But if we're talking way beyond that with this program, because we're talking about having to develop it, having to pay for it, you got to use it, right?
Well, not necessarily. There's all different type of arrangements.
Well, that's what I'm
Regular
hearing.
trail is one.
That's what I'm hearing. Concept wise, I'm with you.
S-line sat basically as an abandoned, tree and weed covered right away for almost 40 years. It was abandoned in the 80s. And, Jeremy was talking about lines out west. That's part of the, was it the Clinchfield system?
Yeah.
Which is now owned by CSX. I mean, I will tell you, all of that's subject to abandonment. The main line structure through there, in addition, they're chipping away at these 1 mile segments, but that whole railroad is subject to abandonment.
100 miles more.
Exactly, and it's a railroad that was built in the early 20th century, I think,
Coal carrier primarily.
to fairly high standards.
Virginia, South Carolina.
So there's a lot of things we could and should have visibility in, and perhaps have an early relationship with the seller, in this case CSX, to utilize it to our best advantage. But I agree with your point. If we don't have to be involved, and we have an assurance that it's revertible, that's a word, then so be it. I just don't think we're there at this point.
So one thing, as we're talking about the policy here, one of the things that we typically do, it's not written down anywhere. It's not something that we're required to do by the General Assembly that I know of. But when there is an abandonment or an underutilized railroad, DRPT works with potential buyers of the railroad. And that's where Jeremy has a lot of experience on the Eastern Shore. Before the trail group ever, got a foothold, he was out there pounding the pavement with short line railroads trying to figure out if this could be saved. And parts of it were able to be saved. Not the full length of the Eastern Shore Railroad, but he did talk to other railroads who were able to use it for freight, and it led to some really good outcomes that we can talk about if we have time. But that's all. That to me is the first step for DRPT. That fits with our mission, and that's our number one whenever there's a chance of an abandonment, and that's what I would want to put into the policy.
Just to give DRPT some credit, but our coordination with the EP is often where we're trying to, before they even start talking about abandonment, they're talking to this discontinued line. We're seeing customers are getting less service or something like that. So when we see those signs, often there's a discussion with the EP. We bring a lot of customers together in a room. We've even gone to Norfolk Southern and CSX and said, we know this is discontinued line. We'd really like to see you short line it. Now we're starting to get into telling them how to run their business, so we have to be very careful there. But the short lines are usually partners in Buckingham Branch, is in Genesee and Wyoming, and some of the Shenandoah Valley. Those are examples of where those were going to be abandonments and they were saved. Virginia Southern, the portion of the Buckingham Branch that Virginia has now purchased, those are all partnerships through DRPT's Rail Preservation Program, where we saved a significant amount of rail lines already.
And a great example of how important these corridors could be for public purposes, which is not, it's been so long, it's forgotten, is Norfolk Southern abandoned the line from about 100 miles or so west of Norfolk, all the way to Norfolk in the 1980s, the former Virginian line.
Used to ride that to school.
And that is now the water pipeline from Lake Gaston to Norfolk, Virginia Beach. And I think probably a heck of a mess down there if you didn't have that water.
Yeah, heck of a mess.
But can you imagine laying a 100-mile pipeline today if you didn't have the corridor already available? I mean, my God.
There's a corridor.
Well, there's broadband, there's all sorts of infrastructure to your point, right? That could be
It's
important.
valuable infrastructure.
Well, right now on the Eastern Shore, broadband goes down the right of way. Quite honestly, when you shoot a rocket off at Virginia Spaceport and it goes awry, the kill message goes down the railroad right away on the broadband interconnectivity pipeline down across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel into Virginia Beach to shoot the rocket up, the rocket launch.
And I know this will give you a lot of stress, but I've done a lot of work on that broadband line to make it work. So Scott's over there going, oh man.
And the other thing that's going on with at least on the Eastern Shore in the right of way is the sewage pipeline, Hampton Road Sanitation, building their pipeline on that right of way. The right of way is 60, the usual railroad right of way is 66 feet wide. In the Eastern Shore's case, in the 50s when CPBT was built, they took up the passenger rail and they're now taking up the freight rail. In effect, they sold it. The steel has actually been sold off, and it's now owned not by the asset owner of the railroad. It's owned by the contractor taking it up.
Emily, I'd like to make one more point. So in the context of what we're talking about, rail banking, rail assets are finite. And if we look at the history of the evolution of railroads in our country, I think we reached a peak of 550, 600,000 miles of rail infrastructure in this country in the 1920s, maybe. And that number has been greater than halved. So we're down to somewhere just over 200,000 miles of active rail infrastructure. I think we can look at our Virginia rail map and know we could sit down and take a look at what's potentially subject to abandonment without a lot of fanfare. And so there are other ways of directing our efforts here and saying, okay, well, these are the 17 segments that we think are important. So you've got that.
So this is a map of the studied rails to trails and rails with trails in blue and the ones that exist now in green. But we do also have a map of the discontinued rail lines and abandoned rail lines. I didn't include it in this presentation because it's not perfect. And it's hard to get that mapping information. So I have it, but it's, and I think it was in that previous presentation from last time. I can share it with you. And yes, we can look at that and investigate those lines and do some due diligence.
Come up with a plan.
Right,
Or
come up with a plan. And I would encourage all of us to, or the policy to include our partners, VDOT and DCR in that work. And we do meet with them on a regular basis. There is a multimodal trails working group that has been meeting, and we could continue something like that to talk about these underused rail lines. So yes, I think that's a good idea. But of course, it's also, we have to keep in mind DRPT's mission and the fact that there are other agencies in the state that do have within their mission statement to work on trails and multi-use trails specifically. And so I feel like being able to communicate and facilitate these abandonments is our primary role in this, and making sure that they're safe for transportation use.
Yeah, well, I think that's the key. Where possible, where there is a compelling future transportation use, be that, passenger or freight. If it's more of a recreational use, I think that's where we really have to work more with DCR. And yeah.
But there's a term, lead agency.
Yeah.
And the way we conduct our businesses as a state. So I would always expect that we could or should be the lead agency in that discussion.
And so there is some policy out there about this. I don't know if you all are familiar with this. It goes back to 2009. HB 2088 is the Rails with Trails / Pedestrian Crossing Project Initiation, Coordination, and Review. That's a mouthful. There's a link to it in the presentation. And it is old. It refers to REF still. But what we've done with it is, it lays out the process for DCR and DRPT to work together to facilitate communication with the railroad in instances where there are pedestrian crossings of railroads, rails with trails. And it also has a basis of design laid out for rails with trails and for some of these crossings. So our role, DRPT's role for years now, since 2009, has been to coordinate, to bring DCR into coordination with the railroads and also communicate with some of the trail advocates and come up with solutions for crossing. So I recommend really building on that model too. It's something that has worked, but it needs to be fleshed out a little bit more, and we need to update it because it still refers to REF.
Good.
I can give you a heads up that the Rails and Trails is about to come to you all, because planning districts of the Roanoke Valley and the Deer River Valley are looking right now, studying how to connect their trails. Both have significant trail systems, but they do not connect. And the way they can connect is right up the railroad that you are negotiating, hopefully buying from Norfolk Southern, which literally touches one end of the trails of the Roanoke Valley and one end of the trails of the New River Valley. Now, there's some issues with that, obviously, like tunnels and things of that nature. You can't just run it up the right of way all the way. Mm-hmm. But the Commonwealth is soon going to be the owner of rails. That there's going to be a proposal coming to add with trails.
That's our new piece, though.
Is that to run on the right of way or to cross the right of way?
To run along the right of way, all the way from Salem to Christiansburg. Which, and there's some 2 or 3 very significant bridges and tunnels and some very narrow cuts in there where there's not room to run along the right of way unless you expand the cut. But that's by far the most likely route.
From a financing standpoint, rails to trails, the governor put 5 million in his budget last year. The Senate bumped that to 40 million. And then the House said, well, let's take a look, drop that down to 10. And by the way, let's have an OIP study to determine what the characteristics are for funding going forward. And we're now waiting for that study to come out, which was from the legislature.
Yeah, we've been coordinating with OIP on that too. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll run out of time soon again. I just want to emphasize that you've started a process of starting to map rail segments that are subject to abandonment. If I could suggest, the next step in this process would be to finalize that process, even if it means outreach to our Class 1 partners, to identify any segment in the Commonwealth that may be subject to abandonment or is currently under abandonment proceedings, and come up with an action plan. So that if it's a first level evaluation of future use, I mean, that would be a real helpful way of starting the discussion. At the end of the day, all I really care about is anything that has future economic potential from a transportation or utility corridor always has the right of reversion. And during the period of time that it's not rail, that it's protected in a way that we have some oversight of to make certain that we don't destroy it simply in the way we use it. That's all I care about. So however that mission gets accomplished, we leave that to you and your clear thinking on it. But, trails is really just one discrete use of probably half dozen that we could come up with. So kind of summarizes my thoughts.
Some of them are
That
not
sounds like a
mutually
policy.
exclusive. Some of them could have trail and broadband.
Sure.
Right down the same
You could have
road.
utilities, broadband, and rail. So
That's great. And of course, there is this rails with trails issue that goes along with this, and the inquiries that have come in so far and that will continue. And so I do have some information about that as well. And just so that you all know, there was a study done with the state of North Carolina and the East Coast Greenway Group a few years ago when we finished up the phase 2 environmental impact statement for the corridor between Petersburg and Raleigh, the S line. We actually did a study for rails with trails. We looked at the right of way that we would and now are going to be acquiring from CSX to see if there was excess right of way that would be able to handle a trail. And so that design is out there. It's I think about a 10% level of design, and there are sections where the right of way couldn't handle a trail, and so there are sections where we recommended acquiring property in some places. But that may be of interest to folks. It's not something we've talked about a lot recently, but there is an example of us studying a rails with trails in the state, and there are other. Virginia Capitol Trail is an example. I mean, I didn't think about this before, but it is a rail with trail for a half mile. It goes underneath the CSX rail line there in Shockoe Bottom, and so. There aren't any formal FRA or Surface Transportation Board requirements for separation or protective treatments. It's all negotiations with the railroads, and of course that safety is important. So negotiations with that trail sponsor and railroad are where this happens. But there are some good examples around the country, and of course the basis of design information that we put together as part of HB 2088 is another good resource that's Virginia specific.
And Emily, I think we're gonna have
to go
in a couple minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So
I think we.
So yeah, rail or trail, that's something we talked about a little bit, about the fact that we need to work with railroads and preserve things for transportation use and for utility use. And then I did want to get to this, examples of trails reverting back to rail. It doesn't happen very often, but it is a provision of this process, and it has happened before. And so these are a couple of examples in Georgia or South Carolina and Pennsylvania of trails that have reverted back to rail use.
And our S line will be another one to add to that list. I think will be the most significant.
All right.
Emily, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
You don't
Sure.
have to round
There are
off.
lots of resources out there, and we can talk. Give me a call anytime.
And I think we've got the basis for mapping out a policy that could go in the rail plan as well. Just,
Good.
I mean, related to being able to, where appropriate, define, file notice as an interested party to work proactively with the Class 1 railroads to identify segments that are subject to abandonment, be able to track those with mapping as well, and then to be able to, where there may be a future use, develop an action plan, and make sure that our primary goal is on maintaining a right to reversion, the transportation use, should that be.
Thank you for bringing up the issues.
Oh, my pleasure. No, this has been a good conversation today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I don't think we have any public comment, so I'm just gonna go ahead and close the meeting, and thank you all. We'll move on to the full.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. That concludes the meeting.
You're not showing